there is a photograph that lives in the memory of everyone who has ever loved hockey. It was taken on a cold January morning in 1993 inside a hospital in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In the photograph, a man sits in a chair with his arm extended, an intravenous line feeding chemicals into his bloodstream. His eyes are tired but steady. His jaw is set with a familiar resolve. He is 6 feet 4 inches tall, and even sitting down, even weakened by disease, he fills the room the way he once filled an arena. His name is Mario Lemieux, and on that morning, he was fighting for his life. Just weeks before, this same man had been the most dominant hockey player on the planet. He was leading the National Hockey League in scoring, as he often did. He was carrying the Pittsburgh Penguins on his broad shoulders, as he always had. He was 27 years old, and he moved on the ice with the ease of someone who had been born to do nothing else. Every shift he took was a masterpiece. Every pass he delivered was a brushstroke on a frozen canvas. Every goal he scored seemed to bend the laws of physics just slightly, as if the puck itself understood that it was in the possession of someone extraordinary. And then a doctor sat him down in a quiet room and told him he had Hodgkin lymphoma, cancer, the word that changes everything, the word that takes the future, which had seemed so certain, so brilliant, so full of possibility, and replaces it with doubt and fear and the cold, clinical language of medical treatment. The story of Mario Lemieux is not simply a hockey story. It is not simply a sports story. It is the story of a man who was given extraordinary gifts and then asked to carry extraordinary burdens. It is a story about pain, not the kind that comes from a slap shot to the wrist or a cross-check to the spine, though he endured plenty of that too. It is the deeper kind of pain, the pain of uncertainty, the pain of sitting in a treatment chair while radiation courses through your body, and knowing that the ice is waiting, but you might never skate on it again. The pain of being told your body is betraying you, even as the entire sport looks to you as its savior. It is the kind of pain that does not show up on an X-ray or a medical chart. It lives in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. It lives in the middle of the night when the house is dark and the world is asleep, and you are alone with the knowledge that nothing will ever be quite the same again. This is also a story about courage, not the theatrical kind, not the kind that makes for easy headlines or dramatic movie scenes, the quiet kind, the stubborn kind, the kind where a man gets out of that treatment chair, drives to the arena, laces up his skates, and plays a hockey game against professional athletes who are healthy and rested and have not spent the morning absorbing radiation, not because he has to, not because anyone expects him to, but because the ice is where he belongs, because he refuses to let the disease define him, because in the deepest part of himself, Mario Lemieux understood that hockey was not just something he did, it was something he was, and to stop playing would be to stop being himself. Pittsburgh in the early 1990s was a complicated city, a city in transition. The steel mills that once defined its skyline and its identity had largely gone silent. The smokestacks no longer belched fire and ash into the grey Pennsylvania sky. The economy was shifting from manufacturing to technology and medicine, and the identity of the city was shifting with it. People were uncertain about the future. They were looking for something to believe in, something to rally around, something that could remind them of what Pittsburgh was, a tough, resilient, blue-collar place where people did not give up when things got hard. And into that uncertainty walked a French-Canadian kid from Montreal who could do things with a hockey puck that defied explanation. He became more than a player to Pittsburgh. He became a symbol, a reason to believe, a living embodiment of the city's own stubborn refusal to be counted out. When he got sick, the city got sick with him. When he fought, the city fought with him. When he came back, the city came back with him. Their fates were intertwined in a way that sports rarely allows, and that logic cannot fully explain. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just what Mario Lemieux did on the ice, though we will walk through that in vivid and complete detail. You are going to understand what it cost him, the pain he hid from the cameras, the treatments he endured in silence, the mornings when he was not sure he could get out of bed, let alone play a hockey game, the moments when the future was so uncertain that even the word tomorrow felt like a luxury he could not afford. You are going to understand why his return from cancer remains one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of professional sports. Not just hockey, but all of professional sports. And you are going to understand why, decades later, the name Lemieux still carries a weight that statistics alone cannot measure. A weight that has nothing to do with goals and assists, and everything to do with the depth of the human spirit. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. This is the story of Le Magnifique, the Magnificent One, a man who played hockey like poetry in motion, a man who stared down cancer and refused to blink, a man whose legacy stretches far beyond goals and assists, far beyond trophies and records, into something deeper and more lasting and more fundamentally human. Something that speaks to the resilience of the spirit itself. Something that reminds us, all of us, regardless of whether we have ever watched a hockey game, that the human body can be broken and the human will can remain whole. Now, let us begin. To understand what Mario Lemieux meant to the game of hockey, you first have to understand what the Stanley Cup means to the men who chase it. Because in hockey, there is no greater prize. There is no higher honour. There is no comparable achievement in any other professional sport. The Stanley Cup is not merely a trophy awarded at the end of a season. It is a covenant, a sacred object passed from one generation of champions to the next. A physical artifact whose silver surface carries the names of every man who has ever been worthy of lifting it. To hold the Stanley Cup is to hold history in your hands. To see your name etched upon it is to know that your place in the game is permanent, that no amount of time can erase what you achieved. And for Mario Lemieux, the pursuit of that cup and the sacrifices it demanded would become inseparable from the story of his life. The cup was first awarded in 1893. Donated by Lord Stanley of Preston, who served as Governor-General of Canada. It was a simple silver bowl at first, purchased for roughly $50, a modest sum even in that era, equivalent perhaps to $1,000 in modern currency. Lord Stanley intended it as a challenge cup to be awarded annually to the best amateur hockey club in the Dominion of Canada. He could not have imagined what his gift would become. He could not have foreseen that more than a century later, grown men, hardened athletes who had spent their careers absorbing punishing body checks and playing through broken bones, would weep openly at the sight of it, that players would sacrifice their health, their comfort, their very bodies for the chance to carry it around an arena while a crowd of 20,000 people roared in celebration. That entire cities would shut down, their streets flooded with jubilant fans, when the cup came home. The early years of the Stanley Cup were chaotic and beautiful. Teams from small Canadian towns, Kenora, Dawson City, Rat Portage, would issue challenges to the reigning champions for the right to hold it. The game itself was rough and barely regulated. The forward pass had not yet been legalized. Teams played with 7 skaters instead of 6. Goalies were required to stand upright at all times, and were penalised for dropping to the ice to make a save. The rinks were often outdoors, carved from frozen ponds and rivers, exposed to the wind and the snow and the bitter Canadian cold. It was a different world, a simpler world. But the cup was already sacred, already the prize that defined the game, already the thing that separated the men who played hockey from the men who conquered it. When the National Hockey League was founded in 1917, the Stanley Cup became its ultimate prize. The league began with just 4 teams: the Montreal Canadiens, the Montreal Wanderers, the Ottawa Senators, and the Toronto Arenas. The Wanderers folded after just 6 games when their arena, the Montreal Arena, burned to the ground on January 2nd, 1918. But the others endured, and from those fragile beginnings, a tradition took root that would grow into something vast and permanent. The cup would become the symbol of hockey excellence, the standard against which every player, every team, every era would be measured. The original 6 period, stretching from 1942, when the New York Americans folded, to 1967, when the league expanded, cemented the cup as hockey's most revered institution. 6 teams competed year after year: the Montreal Canadiens, the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Boston Bruins, the Chicago Blackhawks, the Detroit Red Wings and the New York Rangers. The rivalries were fierce and personal. Players on opposing teams knew each other intimately. They had been checking each other into the boards and competing for the same cup since they were teenagers. The level of competition was extraordinarily high because the talent pool was concentrated into just 6 rosters. Every team was stacked with players who, in a larger league, would have been franchise cornerstones. The Montreal Canadiens dominated the original 6 era in a way that no franchise has dominated professional sports before or since. They won the Stanley Cup an astonishing 10 times between 1953 and 1979, including 5 consecutive championships from 1956 to 1960. Those teams featured a constellation of legends. Maurice "Rocket" Richard, the fierce, dark-eyed winger who was the first player to score 50 goals in a single season. Jean Beliveau, the tall, elegant centre whose grace and dignity set the standard for how a hockey star should conduct himself. Jacques Plante, the revolutionary goaltender who introduced the face mask and changed the position forever. Guy Lafleur, the flowing-haired right winger whose speed and scoring touch thrilled a generation. They played in the Montreal Forum, a building so steeped in history and tradition that players swore they could feel the presence of past champions in its corridors. The ghosts of the Forum, they called them, spirits who watched over the team and willed them to greatness. To lift the Stanley Cup was to join this exclusive brotherhood. Your name would be etched into the silver alongside the greatest players who ever lived. It would remain there permanently. Unlike other championship trophies in professional sports, the Vince Lombardi Trophy in football, the Larry O'Brien Trophy in basketball, the Commissioner's Trophy in baseball, the Stanley Cup is not a new trophy created each year. It is the same physical object, passed from champion to champion across the decades. When you touch the cup, you are touching the same silver that Rocket Richard touched after his final championship in 1960. The same silver that Bobby Orr touched after his famous flying goal in 1970. The same silver that Wayne Gretzky touched when he hoisted it for the first time in 1984. Every scratch on its surface tells a story. Every dent is a memento of celebration. Every name is a promise kept. There is a tradition in hockey, unwritten, but universally observed, that no player touches the Stanley Cup until he has won it. Young players will visit the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto, where the cup is displayed, and refuse to go near it. They will avert their eyes. They will cross to the other side of the room. They believe, with a conviction that borders on the religious, that touching the cup before earning it will bring a curse upon their career. They will never win it. Their team will be cursed. The hockey gods will punish their presumption. Some dismiss this as superstition, but the men who play the game call it something else. They call it respect. Respect for the tradition. Respect for the men who came before. Respect for the idea that some things in life must be earned, not assumed. The expansion era that began in 1967 brought new teams and new markets into the fold. The league doubled from 6 teams to 12 overnight, adding the Philadelphia Flyers, the St. Louis Blues, the Minnesota North Stars, the Los Angeles Kings, the Oakland Seals, and the Pittsburgh Penguins. Further expansion in the 1970s brought the league to 18 teams, and by the time Mario Lemieux was drafted in 1984, the NHL had 21 franchises spread across North America. The growth of the league had diluted the talent pool somewhat, but it had also democratized the cup. New cities, new fan bases, new traditions were being built around the pursuit of that same silver trophy. The Flyers, known as the Broad Street Bullies, won back-to-back cups in 1974 and 75 through intimidation and physical dominance. The New York Islanders won 4 consecutive cups from 1980 to 83, establishing a dynasty on Long Island that rivaled the great Canadiens teams. And then the Edmonton Oilers arrived, led by a skinny kid from Brantford, Ontario, who would rewrite every record in the book. Wayne Gretzky and the Oilers won 5 Stanley Cups between 1984 and 1990. They played a brand of hockey that was breathtaking in its speed and creativity, a style built around Gretzky's supernatural vision and the incredible supporting cast that surrounded him. Mark Messier, Jari Kurri, Paul Coffey, Grant Fuhr, The names read like a roll call of the Hockey Hall of Fame. They scored goals in bunches, they overwhelmed opponents with offense, and they made winning the cup look, if not easy, then at least inevitable. Gretzky was the centerpiece, the great one, the player whose records, 92 goals in a single season, 215 points in a single season, 2,857 career points, seemed designed to stand for eternity. But beneath the surface of Gretzky's dominance, there was a quiet acknowledgement among hockey people that another player was rising, a player whose raw physical talent, the combination of size, skill, speed, and hockey sense, might have been even greater than Gretzky's. This player was tall where Gretzky was slight. He was powerful where Gretzky was elusive. He could dominate a game through sheer force of will in a way that Gretzky, for all his genius, could not. His name was Mario Lemieux, and by the late 1980s, the hockey world understood that the balance of power was shifting. When Gretzky was traded from Edmonton to Los Angeles in August of 1988, the transaction shook the hockey world to its foundation. The trade was not merely a sports transaction. It was a cultural earthquake. In Canada, it was treated as a national betrayal. The greatest player in the history of the sport, the embodiment of Canadian hockey excellence, had been sold to an American city known for sunshine and movie stars. The day of the trade has been called, without exaggeration, the day Canada wept. And yet the trade had a silver lining for those who watched the broader landscape of the sport. With Gretzky in Los Angeles, the spotlight shifted, and in Pittsburgh, Mario Lemieux was ready to step into it. The cup is the hardest trophy to win in professional sports. This is not hyperbole. It is a mathematical and physical reality. To claim it, a team must win 16 games across 4 best-of-7 playoff series against the best competition in the world. The playoffs last approximately 2 months. The games are played every other day, sometimes on consecutive nights when travel is involved. The physical toll is immense. Players routinely compete with broken bones, torn ligaments, separated shoulders, and deep bruises that turn entire sections of their bodies black and purple. They do this because the cup demands it, because the tradition demands it, because the men who came before them played through similar pain and won, and to do less would be to dishonor their memory. Each member of the winning team gets 1 day with the Stanley Cup during the summer following their championship. 1 day, 24 hours with the most famous trophy in all of sports. The traditions that have grown up around this privilege are deeply personal and endlessly varied. Players have taken the cup to their hometowns, carrying it through the streets like a newborn child, while neighbors and strangers alike gathered to see it. They have brought it to hospitals, placing it in the rooms of sick children whose eyes went wide with wonder at the sight of it. They have taken it to the graves of parents and grandparents who did not live to see their sons or grandsons achieve the ultimate prize, setting it down on the headstone and sitting with it in silence. They have filled it with champagne and beer and cereal and baby formula. They have eaten from it, drunk from it, baptized their children in it. Some have taken it swimming. Some have left it on the side of a road by accident. Some have carried it to the tops of mountains. The cup has been to every continent except Antarctica. It has been to war zones and wedding receptions and quiet farmhouses in rural Canada, where an old man wept at the sight of it because he remembered watching it presented on a crackling television set more than half a century ago. This is the tradition that Mario Lemieux entered when he was drafted first overall by the Pittsburgh Penguins in 1984. This is the weight he took upon his shoulders. Not just the weight of a struggling franchise in a football city, not just the weight of being compared to Wayne Gretzky at every turn, but the weight of the cup itself, the weight of 100 years of history, of thousands of names etched in silver, of the ghosts of champions who expected their successors to be worthy. The cup does not care about talent. It does not care about statistics. It cares about sacrifice, about the willingness to pay whatever price is required, and the price it would demand of Mario Lemieux, the price that cancer and chronic pain and a body pushed beyond its limits would extract, was higher than anyone could have imagined. The cup has witnessed many triumphs, and it has witnessed many tragedies. It has been held by men at the peak of their powers, and by men who barely survived to reach the final buzzer. It has been won by teams of destiny and teams of attrition, by rosters built through careful planning and by rosters assembled through sheer luck and circumstance. But in January of 1993, when Mario Lemieux sat in a hospital receiving his first radiation treatment for Hodgkin lymphoma, the cup took on a new significance in the story of one man's life. It was no longer just a trophy to be won. It was a symbol of everything he was fighting for: his career, his identity, his place among the immortals. The cup had already given him two of the greatest moments of his life. Now, the question was whether the man who had lifted it twice would ever be healthy enough to pursue it again. The deeper story is coming, the one that goes beyond the statistics and the trophies and the playoff victories, the one that takes us into the hospital rooms and the treatment centres and the quiet, painful moments that no audience ever saw, the one that explains why Mario Lemieux is not merely one of the greatest hockey players who ever lived, but one of the most courageous human beings to ever step into a professional sporting arena. The cup measures championships, but what we are about to explore measures something far more profound. The Stanley Cup itself has undergone physical transformations over the decades, growing as the game grew. The original bowl, donated by Lord Stanley, sits atop a structure that has been expanded multiple times to accommodate the names of new champions. The current trophy stands nearly 3 feet tall and weighs approximately 35 pounds. It consists of a bowl, 3-tiered bands, a collar and 5 barrel bands, each of which contains the engraved names of 13 championship teams. When a band is full, when all 13 spaces have been filled, the oldest band is retired to the Hockey Hall of Fame and a new blank band is added. This means that names do not remain on the cup forever. Eventually, they are removed and placed in the hall, where they are preserved but no longer carried from city to city, from arena to arena, from celebration to celebration. It is a bittersweet reality. Even the permanence of the cup is, in the end, temporary. Even the names of champions are eventually replaced by newer names, newer victories, newer stories. But while they are there, while those names are etched into the silver and carried around the world, they carry an extraordinary power. They represent the culmination of a lifetime of sacrifice. Every player whose name appears on the cup began as a child, skating on frozen ponds or in cold community rinks, dreaming of the moment when he would lift that trophy. The journey from that first wobbly stride on the ice to the moment of championship glory is long and punishing. It requires years of development, thousands of hours of practice, countless games in junior leagues and minor leagues, and tryout camps. It requires the willingness to be hit, to be knocked down, to get up and keep skating. It requires the mental toughness to endure slumps and injuries, and the constant pressure of performing at the highest level. And at the end of it all, if everything goes right, if the talent is sufficient and the health holds and the team is good enough and the timing is right, there is the cup, waiting, gleaming, ready to be lifted. For the Penguins franchise, the cup had been an elusive dream since the team's founding in 1967. The early years were bleak. The team struggled on the ice and at the gate. Attendance was poor, the roster was thin. The Civic Arena, with its distinctive retractable steel dome, unique in professional sports, often echoed with empty seats. There were years when the franchise's survival was genuinely in question. Rumors of relocation surfaced repeatedly. Kansas City, Hamilton, Portland, various cities were mentioned as potential new homes for the struggling club. The Penguins were the forgotten franchise of the NHL, a team that existed on the margins of the sport's consciousness, overshadowed by the Steelers and their 4 Super Bowl championships. The arrival of Mario Lemieux in 1984 changed everything. Not overnight, transformation takes time, but gradually, irreversibly, completely. Lemieux gave the Penguins something they had never had: a genuine superstar, a player around whom a championship team could be built, a reason for fans to come to the arena and for free agents to consider Pittsburgh as a destination. He was the foundation upon which the franchise's future would be constructed. And when that future finally arrived, when the Penguins won back-to-back Stanley Cups in 1991 and 1992, it was Lemieux who carried the cup around the ice. It was Lemieux whose name was engraved upon it. It was Lemieux who had turned a failing franchise into the champions of the hockey world. The 1991 Cup run was the first championship in Penguins history. The journey to get there had taken 24 years of existence, years of futility and frustration and near collapse. The team that Lemieux led into the playoffs, that spring was talented but unproven. They had never been past the second round before. They were not the favourites. The Bruins, the Canadiens, the Blackhawks, these were the established powers, the teams with championship pedigrees and deep rosters. But the Penguins had something those teams did not have. They had number 66. And in the crucible of the playoffs, with the cup on the line, Lemieux was a force of nature. He scored 44 points in 23 games, controlling the tempo of every series, elevating his teammates with his vision and his skill and his sheer physical presence. When the final buzzer sounded in Game 8 of the finals, a 5-1 victory over the Minnesota North Stars, and Lemieux lifted the cup for the first time, the celebration was not just for a hockey championship. It was for the vindication of a franchise, the validation of a city, the fulfillment of a promise that had been made the day Mario Lemieux first put on a Penguins jersey. The 1992 Cup was won under somber circumstances. Head coach Bob Johnson, the beloved and optimistic leader who had guided the team to its first championship, had been diagnosed with brain tumours and passed away in November of 1991, just months after hoisting the cup. His replacement, Scotty Bowman, was a very different personality, stern, demanding, strategically brilliant, but the team rallied around Johnson's memory and Bowman's expertise. They swept the Chicago Blackhawks in 4 games in the finals, with Lemieux once again winning the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP, 2 championships in 2 years, 2 names on the cup. The dynasty was real. And then came the cancer. And suddenly, the Stanley Cup, with all its history and tradition and weight, became something different in the context of Mario Lemieux's life. It was no longer the ultimate goal. It was a memory, a reminder of what had been and what might never be again. When Lemieux sat in that hospital chair, receiving radiation for Hodgkin lymphoma, the cup was the furthest thing from his mind. Survival was the goal now. Beating the disease was the championship he had to win. And unlike the Stanley Cup playoffs, there were no teammates to help carry the load. This was a fight he had to wage largely alone, in the quiet of treatment rooms and the loneliness of recovery. The ice was waiting. The cup was waiting. But first, Mario Lemieux had to win the most important battle of his life. There is a ritual that takes place in every NHL locker room during the playoffs, a ritual that speaks to the reverence with which the cup is regarded. Before the first game of the first round, before a single puck has been dropped, the captain of each team gathers his players in the dressing room. He does not need to give a long speech. He does not need to invoke statistics or game plans. He simply reminds them what is at stake. 16 wins, that is the number. 16 victories against the best teams in the world, played over 2 grueling months of physical and mental warfare. 16 wins, and your name goes on the cup. 16 wins, and you join the Brotherhood. 16 wins, and you become immortal. The playoffs themselves are a test unlike anything else in professional sports. In basketball, the best teams often cruise through the early rounds. In baseball, a single hot pitcher can carry a team for a series. But in hockey, the margin between winning and losing is razor thin. A deflected puck, a lucky bounce off the boards, a goaltender who finds an extra level of performance. Any of these can swing a series. The physicality increases dramatically in the playoffs. Hits that would draw penalties in the regular season are allowed. Players who barely touched each other in January are grinding each other into the boards in April and May. The speed of the game seems to increase, even as the players' bodies are breaking down from the accumulated toll of an 82-game regular season. Every shift is a battle. Every period is a war. Every game could be the last. For Mario Lemieux, the playoffs represented both the pinnacle of his artistry and the ultimate test of his endurance. His back pain, which was manageable during the regular season when he could pick and choose his shifts and rest on certain nights, became an excruciating companion during the playoffs, when every game mattered and every shift counted. There was no taking a night off. There was no coasting through a second period. The opposition targeted him relentlessly, understanding that if they could slow Lemieux, they could beat the Penguins. Defenders hooked him, held him, cross-checked him in the lower back. the exact spot where the herniated disc sent lightning bolts of pain down his legs. They did it deliberately. They did it because stopping Mario Lemieux required tactics that went beyond conventional defense. And Lemieux absorbed it all. He took the abuse, endured the pain, and responded with goals and assists that seemed to come from a dimension the rest of the players could not access. The bond between a player and the cup is personal in a way that outsiders rarely understand. Wayne Gretzky has described holding the cup for the first time as the most emotional moment of his life. More emotional than his wedding, more emotional than the birth of his children. Bobby Orr, whose career was cut short by knee injuries, has said that his greatest regret is not winning more cups, not the goals he scored or the awards he won, but the additional championships he might have claimed if his body had cooperated. Patrick Roy, the legendary goaltender who won the cup 4 times, kept a photograph of the trophy in his locker throughout his career. It was the first thing he saw every morning when he arrived at the rink. A reminder of what he was working toward. A reminder of what was at stake every time he stepped between the pipes. For Lemieux, the cup represented something even more personal than professional accomplishment. It represented the justification for every sacrifice he had made. Every morning he had struggled out of bed with his back screaming in protest. Every game he had played through pain that would have sidelined other men. Every moment he had spent in treatment rooms and doctors' offices and hospital wards, fighting battles that had nothing to do with hockey, but everything to do with his ability to play it. The cup was the reward for all of that suffering, the proof that it had been worthwhile, that the pain had purchased something permanent and beautiful and eternal. And so, when the cancer came, when the diagnosis threatened to take away not just his health, but his ability to pursue the cup, the stakes were not merely professional, they were existential. The cup was not just a trophy, it was the meaning of his life's work. It was the reason he had endured everything he had endured. And the prospect of never pursuing it again, never feeling the weight of it in his hands, never seeing his name freshly etched upon its surface, was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire ordeal, more devastating in some ways than the disease itself. Because cancer could be treated, it could be fought, it could, with luck and determination, be beaten. But the years it stole, the seasons it took, the playoff runs it prevented, the potential championships it erased, those could never be recovered. Those were gone forever. Joseph Roger Mario Lemieux was born on October 6, 1965, in the city of Montreal, Quebec. He was the youngest of 3 brothers, Alain, Richard and Mario, born to Jean-Guy and Pierrette Lemieux. The family lived in the working-class neighbourhood of Villemar, a modest section of southwest Montreal where the streets were narrow and the winters were long, and the sound of hockey sticks slapping frozen pucks echoed through the cold air from morning until night. It was not a wealthy neighbourhood. It was not a neighbourhood that produced famous people, as a rule, but it was a neighbourhood that understood hockey the way a parish understands its church, as the centre of community life, as the thing around which everything else was organised. Jean-Guy Lemieux worked in construction. Pierrette kept the household running. Money was not abundant, but the necessities were covered, and in a home where 3 boys lived and breathed hockey, the most important resource was not money but ice. Jean-Guy solved this problem with the resourcefulness of a working man. He flooded a patch of the backyard during the winter months, packing snow against the sides to form makeshift boards, creating a rink that was small but serviceable. The boys would play on it for hours, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air, their sticks clattering against each other as they battled for the puck. They played until their fingers were numb, and their toes ached with cold, and their mother called them inside for dinner. And then, after dinner, they went back out. Pierrette Lemieux contributed to her son's hockey education in a way that has become one of the most endearing details of the Lemieux family legend. She would open the front door of the house and allow the frigid winter air to rush in, letting the snow that accumulated in the front hallway remain on the carpet. This created a frozen pathway from the house to the backyard rink, allowing the boys to walk from their bedrooms to the ice without removing their skates. It was a small act of accommodation that spoke volumes about the family's priorities. Hockey came first, comfort came second, And cleanliness, well, cleanliness could wait until spring. Among the three Lemieux brothers, stood out almost immediately. He was bigger than his siblings at every stage of development. His coordination was advanced. His instincts on the ice were uncanny, while other children his age were still learning to balance on their skates. Mario was already stick-handling with a confidence that surprised the adults who watched him. By the time he was 6 years old, he was playing with boys 2 and 3 years his senior, and he was not merely keeping up. He was dominating. Her coaches who worked with him during those early years have described a child who seemed to understand the geometry of the ice intuitively, who could see passing lanes that others could not see, who could anticipate where the puck was going before it got there, who moved with a fluid grace that made the other children look as though they were skating in slow motion. By the time he reached his teenage years, Mario Lemieux was the most sought-after hockey prospect in the province of Quebec. He was tall, already over 6 feet by the time he was 15, and he was growing into his frame with a rapidity that suggested he would become truly enormous by the time he reached adulthood. His hands were large and extraordinarily soft, capable of receiving a pass at full speed and cradling the puck as gently as if it were an egg. His wrist shot was already powerful enough to beat junior goaltenders from distances that should have been safe, and his vision, his ability to see the ice, to process the movement of all 10 skaters and the goaltender simultaneously, to identify the optimal play in a fraction of a second, was unlike anything the scouts had encountered. He joined the Laval Voisins of the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League in 1981 at the age of 15. Junior hockey in Quebec was a crucible, fast, physical, and unforgiving. Players who were not tough enough, who could not absorb punishment and keep performing, were weeded out quickly. Lemieux was not a fighter. He was not an enforcer. He was a pure offensive talent, the kind of player who needed space and time to execute his skills. In junior hockey, space and time were luxuries that opponents were determined to deny. They hit him hard. They hooked him. They slashed his wrists and cross-checked his back and did everything in their power to make his life on the ice as miserable as possible. And it made no difference whatsoever. He scored at will. In his first season with Laval, at 15 years old, he recorded 96 points in 64 games. The following season, he exploded for 184 points in 66 games. And in his third and final junior season, 1983-84, he produced a statistical performance that bordered on the incomprehensible. He scored 133 goals. He added 149 assists. That is 282 points in 70 games, more than 4 points per game, sustained across an entire season. The hockey world had not seen offensive production like this since the glory days of Gretzky's junior career. And unlike Gretzky, who had been a slender, elusive player who relied on quickness and anticipation, Lemieux was a physical marvel, a towering presence, who combined brute strength with artistic finesse in a way that no one had ever seen before. The 1984 NHL entry draft was held on June 9th at the Montreal Forum, a fitting location given that the most coveted prospect in a generation had grown up just a few miles away. It was widely understood that Mario Lemieux would be the first overall pick. The Pittsburgh Penguins, who had finished the previous season with the worst record in the league, held that pick. There had been speculation, some of it substantiated, much of it whispered, that the Penguins had deliberately lost games down the stretch to ensure they would finish last and secure the right to draft Lemieux. This practice, known as tanking, was frowned upon but difficult to prove. What was undeniable was that the Penguins desperately needed Lemieux. Without him, the franchise faced an uncertain future. With him, everything was possible. When Lemieux's name was called, he walked to the podium wearing a dark suit and a neutral expression. The Penguins' management team was waiting for him with a jersey, expecting the traditional moment where the drafted player pulls the sweater over his head and poses for photographs. Lemieux did not put on the jersey. He stood at the podium without it. The moment was awkward and widely televised, and it created an immediate controversy. Was this arrogance? Was this disrespect? Was this a spoiled young man who believed he was too good for the team that had just made him the most important pick in franchise history. The reality was more nuanced. Lemieux and his family felt that the Penguins organization had not handled the pre-draft process with appropriate professionalism. There were issues with communication, with respect, with the basic courtesies that a franchise should extend to the player it intends to build around. Lemieux was making a statement, quietly, stubbornly, in his own way, that he expected to be treated with the same excellence he intended to bring to the ice. It was the first public demonstration of a characteristic that would define his entire career. A quiet, immovable dignity that could be mistaken for coldness, but was actually the expression of a man who knew his own value and refused to accept anything less than what he was worth. Pittsburgh in 1984 was not a hockey town, it was a Steelers town, through and through. The Penguins played in the Civic Arena before crowds that often numbered in the low thousands. The franchise was hemorrhaging money. Local media coverage was minimal. The enthusiasm that greets a first overall draft pick in most cities was muted in Pittsburgh, where football was king and hockey was an afterthought. Lemieux arrived in this environment speaking limited English, carrying the expectations of an entire sport on his shoulders, and facing the daunting task of turning a last-place team into a contender. On his very first shift in the National Hockey League, on October 11, 1984, against the Boston Bruins, Mario Lemieux stole the puck from Ray Bourque, a future Hall of Fame defenseman and one of the best players in the world, and scored a goal. His first shift, his first touch of the puck in the NHL resulted in a goal. It was a moment of such immediate, emphatic brilliance that it announced his arrival more loudly than any press conference or marketing campaign ever could. He was here, he belonged, and the league would never be the same. His rookie season yielded 100 points, 43 goals and 57 assists, and the Calder Memorial Trophy as the NHL's best first-year player. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The way he scored those points was what set him apart. He did not simply accumulate statistics through volume, through making more shots or playing more minutes than everyone else. He scored with a creativity and a flair that was entirely unique. Goals from impossible angles, passes that threaded through 3 defenders to reach a teammate's stick blade with surgical precision. Plays that made veteran opponents stop skating and simply watch, momentarily forgetting that they were supposed to be competing against him rather than admiring him. The rise continued. Year after year, Lemieux added to his game. He gained muscle, he refined his defensive play, he improved his face-off skills, and his offensive output soared to staggering heights. In 1987-88, he won his first Art Ross Trophy with 168 points. The following season, he scored 199 points, 85 goals, and 114 assists, a total that placed him in the rarefied company of Wayne Gretzky as the only players to approach or exceed 200 points in a season. Unlike Gretzky, who benefited from playing alongside Hall of Famers in Edmonton, Lemieux compiled these numbers on a Penguins roster that was decidedly average. He was the team. Without him, the Penguins were a fringe playoff club. With him, they were capable of beating anyone, and it gets harder, because even as Lemieux was establishing himself as the most talented player in the world, even as he was scoring at rates that defied comprehension and carrying an entire franchise on his back, his body was beginning to fail him. The back problems that would shadow his entire career first manifested during his junior hockey days. A herniated disc in his lower spine created chronic pain that varied from day to day but never fully disappeared. Some mornings, the pain was a dull ache that he could manage with medication and stretching. Other mornings, it was a sharp, electric agony that shot down his legs and made it impossible to stand upright. For most people, a herniated disc is a debilitating condition that limits daily activities and requires careful management. For a professional hockey player, a man who earns his living through explosive skating, sudden stops and starts, and the absorption of violent physical contact, it was a potential career ender. Lemieux managed it through a combination of anti-inflammatory medications, physical therapy, epidural injections, and sheer willpower. Before every game, He would lie flat on his back in the training room, sometimes for an hour or more, while therapists worked to loosen the muscles around his spine and reduce the inflammation enough for him to function. Then he would stand, dress, walk to the ice, and perform at a level that no one else in the world could match. The first Stanley Cup championship in 1991 was the culmination of years of building. General manager Craig Patrick had assembled a roster of talented supporting players around Lemieux. Ron Francis, acquired from the Hartford Whalers in a trade that is now regarded as one of the most lopsided in NHL history, was the perfect complement, a brilliant two-way centre who could handle defensive responsibilities and free Lemieux to focus on offence. Paul Coffey brought offensive firepower from the blue line. Tom Barrasso provided solid goaltending, and a 19-year-old Czech winger named Jaromír Jágr was beginning to show flashes of the generational talent that would define his own remarkable career. Under head coach Bob Johnson, a warm, enthusiastic man whose catchphrase, "It's a great day for hockey," became the team's unofficial motto, the Penguins entered the 1991 playoffs with confidence but not certainty. They dispatched the New Jersey Devils and the Washington Capitals in the first two rounds, then faced the Boston Bruins in the conference finals. The Bruins were a tough, physical team that tested the Penguins' resolve, but Lemieux was magnificent, scoring, passing, controlling the tempo of every game with his presence. Pittsburgh won in 6 games and advanced to the Stanley Cup final against the Minnesota North Stars. The final was not close. After losing Game 1 at home, the Penguins won 4 straight, clinching the championship with a decisive 5-1 victory in Minnesota. Lemieux finished the playoffs with 44 points in 23 games and won the Conn Smythe Trophy as the most valuable player of the postseason. When he lifted the cup above his head on the ice in Minnesota, the tears in his eyes were tears of vindication. He had come to Pittsburgh as an 18-year-old facing skepticism and indifference. He was leaving the ice as a champion. The second championship in 1992 was earned under the shadow of loss. Bob Johnson's death from brain tumours in November of 1991 devastated the team. His replacement, Scotty Bowman, brought a different energy, colder, more disciplined, more strategically complex, but the team responded. They swept the Chicago Blackhawks in the final, outscoring them 23-6 across 4 games. Lemieux won the Conn Smythe again, becoming just the second player in history to win the award in consecutive years. 2 cups, 2 Conn Smythes. The dynasty was real, but here is what makes this story unforgettable. Less than a year after hoisting his second Stanley Cup, Mario Lemieux would be diagnosed with cancer. The body that had carried him to the pinnacle of his sport, that had endured the punishment of professional hockey, the chronic pain of a damaged spine, the accumulated toll of a decade of elite competition, was now under attack from within. And the battle that followed would test him in ways that no hockey game, no playoff series, no championship run ever could. The diagnosis came in January of 1993, during what should have been the greatest season of Lemieux's career. He was 27 years old. He was in the prime of his athletic life. He was playing the best hockey of his career. And given the standard he had already established, that is an almost unbelievable statement. Through the first 36 games of the season, he had amassed 104 points. That is nearly 3 points per game, a rate of production so absurd that it belonged more to a video game than to real life. He was on pace to score over 200 points, a barrier that only Wayne Gretzky had ever breached. The Penguins were the class of the Eastern Conference. Everything was aligned for a season that would have cemented Lemieux's legacy beyond any possibility of debate. And then a doctor found a lump on his neck. The lump was discovered during a routine physical examination. It was small, unremarkable to the untrained eye, but the doctor who found it knew enough to be concerned, and subsequent testing confirmed the worst. Hodgkin lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system, the type of cancer that attacks the body's immune defenses. The announcement was made public on January 12, 1993, at a press conference in Pittsburgh that drew reporters from across North America. Lemieux appeared before the cameras wearing a suit and a composed expression. He was calm, steady. He spoke about the diagnosis with the same measured tone he used when discussing a regular season game. He said the doctors were confident about the prognosis. He said the treatment plan was aggressive but manageable. He said he intended to beat the disease and return to playing hockey. The room was quiet. Reporters who had spent years chronicling Lemieux's goals and assists sat in stunned silence. Some had tears in their eyes. This was not supposed to happen. Not to him. Not to the man who could take a hockey puck and make it dance on his stick blade like a trained animal. Not to the man who had lifted the Stanley Cup twice and seemed destined to lift it again. Cancer was something that happened to ordinary people in ordinary circumstances. It was not supposed to touch the most gifted athlete in the sport. But cancer does not care about gifts. It does not care about talent or fame or the number of points on a scoring sheet. It comes for whomever it chooses, and in January of 1993, it chose Mario Lemieux. The treatment protocol called for radiation therapy focused on the lymph nodes in his neck. The treatments would be administered over a period of several weeks, with sessions scheduled on a regular basis. The side effects were well documented and, for a professional athlete, particularly cruel. Fatigue, the deep, bone-level exhaustion that makes even simple tasks feel monumental. Nausea, loss of appetite, weakened immune function, leaving the body vulnerable to infections that a healthy person would shrug off without notice. And for Lemieux, whose livelihood depended on the precise functioning of every muscle and nerve in his body, the potential impact on his physical performance was an additional torment. The radiation would weaken him. It would sap his energy. It would rob him of the explosive speed and tireless endurance that had made him the dominant player in the world. He began the treatments immediately. The first session was administered at a hospital in Pittsburgh. Lemieux lay on a table while a machine directed concentrated beams of radiation at the affected lymph nodes in his neck. The process was painless in the moment, but devastating in its aftermath. Within days, the fatigue set in. It was unlike any tiredness he had experienced before, different from the exhaustion of a hard practice or a long road trip. This was cellular fatigue, the kind that comes from the inside out, the kind that makes your bones feel hollow and your muscles feel like they are filled with sand. He slept for hours and woke feeling as though he had not slept at all. Despite the treatments, Lemieux insisted on staying connected to the team. He attended practices when his energy allowed, watching from the bench while his teammates worked through drills. He studied game film. He spoke with coaches about strategy. He maintained his presence in the locker room, understanding intuitively that his teammates needed to see him, needed to know that he was still fighting, still engaged, still the leader of the hockey club. The cancer had taken his health, but it had not taken his authority. It had not taken his mind, and it had not taken his will. The hockey world rallied around him in ways that were both touching and revealing. Opposing players, men who had spent their careers trying to stop Lemieux, men who had hooked him and slashed him and cross-checked him into the boards, sent messages of support and encouragement. Wayne Gretzky, his great rival, spoke publicly about his admiration for Lemieux and his confidence that his friend would beat the disease. Fans in Pittsburgh organized prayer vigils and fundraising events. Letters poured into the Penguins' offices from across North America and beyond, from children who drew pictures of number 66 skating through defenders, from cancer patients who saw in Lemieux a fellow warrior, from elderly hockey fans who had watched the game their entire lives and could not bear the thought of losing another legend too soon. The Penguins played on without him, winning some games and losing others, but missing the spark that only Lemieux could provide. The team was talented enough to compete without him. It was not talented enough to dominate. That required the one thing that cancer had temporarily taken away, the presence of number 66 on the ice, bending the game to his will with every shift. As the weeks passed, the treatments continued. Lemieux endured session after session, each one followed by days of debilitating fatigue and discomfort. He lost weight. His face grew gaunt. The powerful frame that had once intimidated defenders became thinner, the muscles less defined. He looked, according to those who saw him during this period, like a man who was fighting something enormous and invisible. Which, of course, he was. But through it all, he never wavered in his intention to return. Other athletes in similar circumstances might have accepted the lost season, might have focused entirely on recovery and planned a comeback for the following year. Not Lemieux. He wanted to play. He needed to play. The ice was not merely a workplace. It was the place where he felt most alive, most himself, most capable of controlling the world around him. In a hospital, he was a patient, passive, dependent, subject to the decisions of doctors and the whims of a disease. On the ice, he was the master. On the ice, he decided what happened next. And the desire to reclaim that mastery, to assert his will over the disease, by returning to the one arena where his will had always been supreme, drove him through every painful treatment session and every exhausting day of recovery. The final radiation session was administered on the morning of March 2nd, 1993. That evening, Mario Lemieux boarded a plane to Philadelphia, flew to the city of brotherly love, walked into the Spectrum Arena, put on his equipment, and played a National Hockey League game against the Philadelphia Flyers. He had received cancer treatment that morning. He played professional hockey that evening. The juxtaposition is staggering. The courage it required is almost beyond comprehension. He scored a goal and added an assist. The Penguins lost the game 4-3, but the result was an afterthought. What mattered was that Lemieux was back. That cancer had thrown its best punch, and he was still standing. That the Magnificent One had been diminished, but not destroyed. Over the remaining 20 games of the season, Lemieux played with a ferocity and a focus that astonished even those who had watched him perform miracles on the ice for nearly a decade. He scored 56 points in those 20 games, a pace of nearly 3 points per game. He was not merely playing well for a cancer survivor. He was playing at a level that no healthy player in the league could match. The radiation had weakened his body, but it had not touched his hands. It had not touched his vision. It had not touched the extraordinary neural wiring that allowed him to process the movement of the game faster than anyone else alive. The physical container was damaged, but the talent inside it remained intact. And when the final statistics for the season were tallied, Mario Lemieux had accomplished something that defied all medical logic and all sporting precedent. Despite missing 24 games, nearly a third of the season, he had won the Art Ross Trophy as the league's leading scorer with 160 points. He had surpassed Pat LaFontaine of Buffalo, who had played all 84 games and finished with 148 points. A man who had spent weeks receiving cancer treatment had outscored every healthy player in professional hockey. He won the Hart Trophy that year as the league's most valuable player. The selection was unanimous. There was no other candidate. No other player had done what Lemieux had done. No other player had faced what he had faced and responded with such extraordinary performance. The award recognized not just his statistical accomplishments, but something deeper, the indomitable spirit of a man who had looked at the worst thing that could happen to him and decided that it would not be enough to stop him. The Penguins went on a 17-game winning streak during that stretch, a franchise record and one of the longest in NHL history. Lemieux was the architect of every victory. Night after night, in arena after arena, he took the ice looking visibly thinner and more fatigued than the Mario Lemieux of previous seasons. And night after night, he scored goals that only he could score, passes that only he could make, plays that left crowds gasping and opponents shaking their heads in bewildered admiration. The cancer season was not just the greatest individual performance of Lemieux's career. It may have been the greatest individual season in the history of professional hockey, given the circumstances under which it was achieved. The remission was confirmed later that spring. The cancer was gone. The radiation had done its job. The disease that had threatened to end his career and potentially his life had been defeated. But the victory was not without cost. The treatments had accelerated the deterioration of his already damaged back. The muscles that supported his spine had atrophied during the weeks of inactivity and illness. The chronic inflammation that had plagued him for years was now compounded by the lingering effects of radiation. He was cancer-free, but he was not healthy. He was not the same Mario Lemieux who had entered that season. The disease had been beaten, but it had exacted a toll that would reverberate through the remaining years of his career. In the 1993-94 season, The back problems returned with a vengeance. He played just 22 games, recording 37 points, before the pain became too severe to continue. The following season, 1994-95, he did not play at all. For the first time since he was a teenager, Mario Lemieux spent an entire winter without stepping onto the ice in a competitive game. The official reason was the chronic back condition. But those who knew him understood that it was more than that. The cancer, the back pain, the years of playing through agony that would have retired lesser men, all of it had finally accumulated to a point where his body was simply unable to keep going. He was 29 years old, and he was already an old man in hockey terms. His body had lived a lifetime of abuse in the span of a decade. When he returned for the 1995-96 season, the comeback was remarkable by any standard. He played 70 games and scored 69 goals, the highest single-season total of his career, with 92 assists for 161 points. He won the Art Ross Trophy and the Hart Trophy for the third time. At 30 years old, after missing an entire season, after cancer, after chronic back problems that would have ended most careers years earlier, he was once again the most dominant player in hockey. It was a performance that defied logic, defied medical science, and defied the natural aging curve that governs all athletes. It was, in many ways, the purest expression of Mario Lemieux's extraordinary talent, even diminished, even battered, even carrying the weight of illness and injury. He was simply better than everyone else. He played one more full season, 1996-97, recording 50 goals and 122 points in 76 games. It was another outstanding year by any conventional measure, but those who watched closely could see the toll accumulating. He was more selective in his effort, conserving energy for the moments that mattered most. His shifts were shorter, his recovery time between games was longer. The explosive acceleration that had once defined his game, that ability to go from a standing start to full speed in 3 strides, was diminished. He was still extraordinary. He was still capable of moments of breathtaking brilliance. But the supply of those moments was finite, and it was being depleted faster than it could be replenished. He retired for the first time in April of 1997. He was 31 years old. His career statistics: 613 goals and 1,494 points in 745 games were staggering. His points per game average of 2.01 was second only to Gretzky's in NHL history. He was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame immediately, with the traditional 3-year waiting period waived in recognition of his extraordinary contributions to the sport. The ceremony was emotional. The tributes were heartfelt. The hockey world mourned the premature end of a career that had been simultaneously brilliant and brutally curtailed. But retirement, for a man like Mario Lemieux, was not an ending. It was a transition. And the chapter that followed, the chapter that would see him transform from player to owner, and eventually from owner back to player, would prove to be every bit as dramatic and improbable as the chapters that had come before. The return from cancer was not a single moment. It was a series of moments, each one more improbable than the last, each one a quiet act of defiance against a disease that had tried to take everything from him. To understand the full weight of what Mario Lemieux accomplished in the weeks and months after his diagnosis, you have to walk through it step by step. You have to see the numbers. You have to feel the context. And you have to recognize that what he did has never been repeated. Not in hockey, not in any other professional sport. It stands alone in the history of athletic achievement, a monument to what the human spirit can accomplish when it refuses to yield. The first moment that demands examination is the game in Philadelphia on March 2nd, 1993. This is the game that has become legend. The game where Lemieux received his final radiation treatment in the morning and played a hockey game that evening. But the legend, as vivid as it is, does not capture the full reality. The reality is that Lemieux woke up that morning in Pittsburgh, feeling the cumulative effects of weeks of radiation therapy. His body was weakened, his energy was depleted, he had lost visible weight. The skin on his neck, where the radiation had been focused, was red and irritated. The fatigue was a constant companion, a heaviness that settled into his bones and made every movement feel like it was being performed underwater. he drove to the hospital. He lay on the treatment table for the final time. The radiation machine hummed and clicked as it delivered its measured dose of energy to the cancerous cells in his lymph nodes. When the session was over, he stood up, got dressed, and drove to the airport. He boarded a flight from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, a short trip, barely an hour in the air, but a journey that felt infinitely longer given what he was carrying. His body was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. His muscles ached with a fatigue that went beyond the physical. And yet, when the plane landed, when he arrived at the Spectrum Arena, when he walked into the visiting locker room and began to dress for the game, something shifted. The arena, the noise, the ice, the familiar rituals of preparation, taping his stick, stretching his legs, pulling the jersey over his head. These things were medicine. They were the antidote to the poison that had been flowing through his veins for weeks. On the ice, he was not a cancer patient. He was number 66, he was Le Magnifique, and for 60 minutes of hockey, the disease did not exist. He scored a goal that night. A classic Lemieux goal, receiving the puck in stride, protecting it with his long reach, releasing a wrist shot that found the top corner of the net with the precision of a guided missile. He added an assist on another goal. The Penguins lost the game, 4-3, but the result was utterly irrelevant. What mattered was that Mario Lemieux had played, that he had competed at the highest level of professional hockey on the same day he had received cancer treatment, that he had looked at the disease and said, without words, that it was not enough, that he was still here, that he was still himself. The second moment is the stretch of games that followed his return. 20 games remained in the regular season when Lemieux came back. 20 games in which to prove that his return was not a publicity stunt, not a single night of adrenaline-fueled defiance, but a genuine resumption of elite-level play. He proved it beyond any doubt. In those 20 games, he recorded 56 points. That is 2.8 points per game, a pace that would be extraordinary for any player in any circumstance. And that was almost beyond comprehension given what Lemieux had endured. He scored goals from every area of the ice, on the power play, at even strength, short-handed. He made passes that threaded through defensive formations like a needle through fabric. He dominated games in a way that he had always dominated games, as if the cancer and the treatments and the weeks of absence had been nothing more than a brief intermission. The numbers are striking. Consider the raw mathematics of what Lemieux accomplished that season. He played 60 games out of a possible 84. He recorded 160 points. That is 2.67 points per game, the highest per-game average of his career. He won the Art Ross Trophy by 12 points over Pat LaFontaine, who had played 24 more games. He won the Hart Trophy unanimously. He led the Penguins on a 17-game winning streak, during which the team was virtually unbeatable. And he did all of this while his body was still recovering from the effects of radiation therapy, while his immune system was still compromised, while the fatigue from the treatments lingered in his muscles and his bones like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. The third moment is the rivalry with Wayne Gretzky, which reached its most poignant phase during this period. Gretzky and Lemieux had been the two dominant players in hockey since the mid-1980s. Their rivalry was not personal. They were, by all accounts, friends who respected each other deeply, but it was intense and consequential. Gretzky held virtually every offensive record in the sport. Lemieux was the one player who had the talent to challenge those records, and the cancer season, paradoxically, only strengthened Lemieux's case, because while Gretzky had accomplished his feats while playing on teams loaded with talent, the Edmonton Oilers of the 1980s featured multiple Hall of Famers. Lemieux had done his work, largely alone, carrying a franchise that would have been mediocre without him. The comparison between the two is one of the great debates in hockey history, and the cancer diagnosis added a dimension to that debate that went beyond statistics. Gretzky's career was a testament to sustained excellence over a long period. He played 20 seasons and accumulated more points than anyone who has ever lived. Lemieux's career was a testament to peak excellence under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. He played fewer games, scored fewer total points, and won fewer championships than Gretzky. But his per-game production was virtually identical, and he achieved it while battling cancer, chronic back problems, and a series of injuries that would have ended most careers years earlier. The question of who was better, Gretzky or Lemieux, may never be answered definitively, but the question of who accomplished more relative to what was possible, given the obstacles each faced, may have a clearer answer. The fourth moment is the first retirement in 1997 and the extraordinary events that followed. When Lemieux walked away from hockey at age 31, he left behind a career that was simultaneously brilliant and incomplete. Brilliant, because the numbers were extraordinary. 613 goals, 881 assists, 1,494 points in just 745 games. Incomplete, because everyone who had ever watched him play knew that he had more to give, that the talent was still there, imprisoned inside a body that could no longer house it properly. The retirement was the right decision medically and practically. It was also a source of profound sadness for anyone who appreciated the artistry of what Mario Lemieux did on the ice. But the story took an unexpected turn almost immediately. The Pittsburgh Penguins, the franchise that Lemieux had carried to 2 Stanley Cup championships, were in dire financial straits. The team was losing money at an alarming rate. Attendance had declined, revenue was insufficient to cover expenses, and the franchise owed Mario Lemieux approximately $32 million in deferred salary. Money that had been agreed upon during his playing days, but that the team simply did not have the resources to pay. The Penguins filed for bankruptcy protection in 1998. The franchise was on the verge of dissolution or relocation. The team that Lemieux had built, the legacy he had established, the championships he had won, all of it was about to disappear. Lemieux responded with a move that was unprecedented in the history of professional sports. Rather than pursuing his claim as a creditor and potentially contributing to the franchise's collapse, he converted his $32 million debt into equity. He became the majority owner of the Pittsburgh Penguins, a player buying his own team. It had never happened before in the NHL. It was a financial gamble of enormous proportions. He was essentially betting his personal fortune on the viability of a franchise that was bleeding money. But it was also an act of loyalty and love. He had spent his entire career in Pittsburgh. He had raised his family there. He had won his championships there. He was not going to let the franchise die. Not on his watch. The ownership of the Penguins gave Lemieux a new purpose after retirement. He threw himself into the business of running a hockey franchise with the same intensity he had brought to playing. He attended board meetings. He reviewed contracts. He worked with general manager Craig Patrick to reshape the roster. He advocated for a new arena to replace the aging Civic Arena, understanding that the franchise's long-term viability depended on a modern facility with luxury suites and premium seating. He was, by all accounts, a hands-on owner who understood the game from both the ice level and the executive suite. But as the month passed, and then the years, something began to stir inside him. The desire to play had never fully disappeared. It lived in his muscles and his bones and his dreams. He would watch the Penguins play, and his hands would instinctively grip the armrests of his seat, mirroring the stick handling he would have been doing if he were on the ice. He would watch a play develop and see the passing lane a split second before the player with the puck saw it, and he would think, I could make that pass. I could still do that. The fire was still burning. It had never gone out. By the fall of 2000, the desire had become irresistible. Lemieux was 35 years old. He had been retired for 3.5 years. His back was still a problem, but the pain had stabilized to a level that was manageable, if never comfortable. The cancer remained in remission, and his doctors saw no medical reason why he could not return to physical activity. The question was not whether his body could handle hockey. The question was whether, after nearly 4 years away from the game, he could still compete at the highest level. The skeptics were numerous. Professional athletes who step away from their sport for extended periods almost never come back successfully. The game moves on, new players arrive, systems evolve. The reaction time that separates elite performers from everyone else dulls with age and disuse. At 35, with a damaged back and a history of cancer, the odds of a successful comeback were slim. Lemieux did not care about the odds. He had never cared about the odds. His entire career had been an exercise in defying what was supposed to be possible. He began training in the fall of 2000, working with fitness coaches and skating coaches to rebuild the conditioning he had lost during his years away. The process was grueling. His back protested at every turn. Muscles that had not been subjected to the demands of professional hockey in years screamed with exertion. But slowly, incrementally, the body remembered. The hands remembered. The timing that allows a hockey player to receive a pass in stride, to release a shot at the precise moment when the goaltender is vulnerable, to execute a deke, a deceptive move, at the exact instant when the defender commits. That timing returned, rusty at first, and then with increasing clarity. On December 27, 2000, Mario Lemieux skated onto the ice at the Civic Arena wearing the Pittsburgh Penguins jersey for the first time in over 3.5 years. The opponent was the Toronto Maple Leafs. The arena was sold out. The crowd was electric, with an anticipation that bordered on disbelief. Could he still do it? Could a 35-year-old man with a bad back and a cancer history, who had not played a professional hockey game since April of 1997, compete against players in their physical prime? The answer came on his very first shift. Lemieux received a pass, surveyed the ice with those extraordinary eyes, and delivered a perfect tape-to-tape pass to a teammate who buried the puck in the back of the net. Assist. First shift. First touch. The arena erupted. It was as if time itself had been suspended, as if the 3.5 years of retirement had been compressed into nothing, and Mario Lemieux had simply returned to the place where he belonged. He finished the game with a goal and 2 assists, 3 points on his first night back. The hockey world was stunned, then ecstatic, then deeply moved. This was not a gimmick. This was not a farewell tour or a publicity exercise. This was Mario Lemieux playing real hockey, producing at a level that most active players could not match on their best night. The comeback was real. Over the remainder of that 2000-2001 season, Lemieux played 43 games and recorded 76 points, 35 goals and 41 assists. His per-game average of 1.77 was among the highest in the league. He was selected to the All-Star game, where he was named the game's most valuable player after an electrifying performance that reminded the hockey world of what it had been missing. He was nominated for the Hart Trophy as the league's most valuable player. At 35 years old, after cancer, after 3.5 years of retirement, after chronic back problems that had plagued him for over a decade, Mario Lemieux was once again among the elite players in professional hockey. The comeback also had a profound impact on the Penguins franchise. Attendance soared, revenue increased. The team, which had been struggling both on the ice and at the gate, was suddenly relevant again. Lemieux's return was not just a personal triumph, it was a financial lifeline for the franchise he owned. Every game he played put more fans in the seats and more money in the coffers. The player-owner dynamic, which had seemed so unusual when it was first established, now made perfect sense. Lemieux was simultaneously the team's greatest asset and its chief executive. He was the product and the proprietor. It was a dual role that had never existed before in professional sports, and Lemieux navigated it with the same understated competence he brought to everything. The 2001 to 2002 season brought the 5th great moment of this chapter, the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City. Lemieux was named captain of Team Canada, selected to lead a roster of extraordinary talent in pursuit of Olympic gold, a prize that Canada had not won in men's hockey since 1952, a drought of 50 years that had become a source of national anguish. The team included Joe Sakic, the quiet, deadly shooting center from Colorado, Steve Yzerman, the legendary Red Wings captain, who was dealing with his own chronic knee problems, Scott Niedermayer, the supremely talented defenseman, Jarome Iginla, a young power forward with the speed of a winger and the strength of a boxer, Martin Brodeur, the all-time great goaltender, and leading them all, wearing the captain's C on his jersey, was Mario Lemieux, 36 years old, held together by willpower and medication, his body a patchwork of damage and determination. The Olympic tournament was a test of national pride and personal resilience. Canada struggled in the early rounds, losing to Sweden and barely defeating Germany. The pressure mounted with each game. The Canadian media, never shy about expressing its opinions, questioned whether the team's veterans, Lemieux, Yzerman, Al MacInnis, were too old and too injured to compete at the highest level. The criticism stung but also motivated. These were proud men who had won Stanley Cups and World Championships, men who understood pressure and knew how to perform under it. The gold medal game, played on February 24, 2002, pitted Canada against the United States before a partisan American crowd. The Canadiens were underdogs on paper, playing on American soil against a talented and hungry American team that had the advantage of home ice. But Canada had something the Americans did not. They had Mario Lemieux, not the Mario Lemieux of 1992, who could single-handedly dominate a game through sheer physical superiority. This was a different Lemieux, older, wiser, more deliberate, his body held together with the athletic equivalent of tape and wire, but his presence was enormous. His calm authority steadied the younger players. His championship experience provided a template for how to handle the pressure of the biggest game on the biggest stage. Canada won, 5-2. Joe Sakic scored the opening goal and was named the tournament's most valuable player. But Lemieux's contribution, 2 goals and 4 assists in 5 games, went beyond statistics. He had set the tone for the entire tournament. He had shown his teammates, by example, what it meant to represent your country at the highest level. He had provided the leadership, the composure, and the competitive fire that had been the hallmark of his career. The gold medal was the one major prize that had eluded him throughout his playing days, and winning it at 36, after everything he had endured, felt less like an athletic accomplishment and more like a benediction, a final gift from the hockey gods to a man who had given everything to the game. The final seasons of the comeback were marked by diminishing returns and increasing physical limitations. In 2001 to 2002, Lemieux played 24 regular season games, recording 6 goals and 25 points, before hip pain, a new affliction, layered atop the chronic back problems, forced him to miss extended stretches. In 2002 to 2003, he played 67 games and scored 91 points, showing flashes of the old brilliance interspersed with periods of visible struggle. The body that had been pushed beyond all reasonable limits was finally, irreversibly breaking down. His final NHL season, 2003 to 2004, was brief and bittersweet. He played 10 games, recording 1 goal and 8 points, before the pain became too much. There was no dramatic farewell game, no ceremony, no final lap around the ice while a crowd stood and wept. He simply stopped playing. The announcement was quiet and dignified, delivered in the same measured tones that had characterized every public statement of his career. The body had said enough, and this time, after years of ignoring its pleas, Mario Lemieux listened. The full statistical picture of his career is both magnificent and heartbreaking. In 915 career games, he scored 690 goals and added 1,033 assists for 1,723 points. His career points per game average of 1.883 is second only to Wayne Gretzky's in NHL history. He won 2 Stanley Cups, 3 Hart trophies, 6 Art Ross trophies, and 2 Conn Smythe trophies. He was a 10-time All-Star. He won an Olympic gold medal. He was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame twice, once as a player, and later recognized as a builder for his contributions as an owner. He saved a franchise from bankruptcy. He mentored a generation of young players. He raised tens of millions of dollars for cancer research. But the number that haunts hockey historians is not any of those. It is 513. That is the number of regular season games Lemieux missed due to injury, illness, and retirement during his career. 513 games that he was unable to play, if he had played those games at even a conservative pace. Say 1.5 points per game, well below his career average of 1.88. He would have added approximately 770 points to his career total. That would have given him roughly 2,493 points, putting him within 400 points of Gretzky's all-time record, and almost certainly making him the second highest scorer in NHL history by a wide margin. And if he had played those games at his actual career pace, which is a reasonable assumption for a player of his caliber, the total would have been even higher. The lost points, the lost goals, the lost seasons. These are the ghosts that haunt the legacy of Mario Lemieux, not because what he accomplished was insufficient, it was extraordinary by any measure, but because what he might have accomplished, had his health cooperated, is almost unimaginable. The cruel arithmetic of his career is this: he was given perhaps the most complete set of physical tools ever bestowed upon a hockey player. The size, the hands, the vision, the shot, the skating ability, the competitive fire, and then he was systematically denied the health to fully deploy them. The back problems alone cost him hundreds of games. The cancer cost him more. The hip injuries during his comeback further diminished what was already a reduced body. And yet, and this is the part that elevates his story from mere athletic biography to something approaching mythology, even at 50 or 60% of what he could have been, he was still one of the 5 or 6 best players who ever lived. Imagine 100% Mario Lemieux. Imagine a full career, 80 or more games every season, no cancer, no back problems, no premature retirements. Imagine the numbers. Imagine the championships. Imagine the records that might have fallen. It is a thought experiment that haunts hockey fans to this day. Not with bitterness, but with a kind of wistful awe. There is one more set of moments from the Lemieux era that demands attention, because they capture the essence of who he was and what he meant to everyone who watched him play. These are not the highlight reel goals or the record-breaking performances, though there were plenty of both. These are the quieter moments, the ones that reveal the character behind the talent. There was the night in 1988 when Lemieux scored 5 goals in 5 different ways against the New Jersey Devils on New Year's Eve. He scored at even strength. He scored on the power play. He scored shorthanded. He scored on a penalty shot. And he scored into an empty net. 5 goals, 5 different methods in a single game. It was a performance of such variety and virtuosity that it seemed almost scripted, as if a playwright had designed the perfect showcase for the full range of Lemieux's talents. No player in NHL history had ever accomplished this feat before. No player has accomplished it since. It stands alone in the record books, a statistical curiosity that is also a work of art. There was the 1987 Canada Cup tournament, when a 21-year-old Lemieux played alongside Wayne Gretzky on a line that many consider the greatest offensive partnership in the history of international hockey. The two greatest players of their generation, skating together on the same line, feeding off each other's talent in a way that created a synergy greater than the sum of its already extraordinary parts. In the decisive third game of the final against the Soviet Union, with the series tied at 1 game apiece, Lemieux scored the winning goal in overtime. Gretzky carried the puck up the ice, drawing the Soviet defenders toward him with the magnetic pull of his reputation, and then slid a perfect pass to Lemieux, who one-timed it past the goaltender. It was a goal that clinched the tournament, a goal that announced Lemieux as a player of the highest order on the international stage, and a goal that forged a bond between two men who would spend the next decade being compared to each other. Gretzky later called Lemieux the most talented player he had ever seen. Coming from the greatest player in history, it was a statement of extraordinary significance. There was the night in 1993, shortly after his return from cancer treatment, when Lemieux stood at center ice in Pittsburgh and received a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. The crowd at the Civic Arena, the same crowd that had been sparse and indifferent when he first arrived in 1984, stood and cheered with a passion that transcended mere fandom. These were not people celebrating a goal or a victory. They were celebrating the fact that their hero was still alive, that he was still standing, that he had looked at cancer and said no. The emotion in the building was palpable. Players on both teams tapped their sticks on the ice in the traditional hockey salute. Lemieux stood at center ice, his eyes glistening, and absorbed the love that was washing over him like a wave. It was one of the most purely emotional moments in the history of the sport, a moment that had nothing to do with statistics or standings, and everything to do with the connection between a man and the people who believed in him. There was the transition to ownership, when Lemieux did something that no athlete in any major professional sport had ever done. He converted his deferred salary, money he was owed, money he had earned through years of playing through pain and injury, into ownership shares. It was a financial masterstroke that also happened to be an act of profound personal loyalty. He could have walked away. He could have pursued his claim through the bankruptcy courts and recovered some portion of what he was owed. Instead, he chose to become an owner. He chose to shoulder the financial risk of a struggling franchise because he could not bear the thought of watching it disappear. He chose Pittsburgh the same way Pittsburgh had chosen him 2 decades earlier, with faith, with commitment, with a belief that the best was yet to come. And there was the final act, the second retirement, quiet and dignified, with no fanfare and no drama. Just a man accepting what his body had been telling him for years, that it was time. That the ice, which had been his sanctuary for so long, could no longer be his home. That the chapter was closing, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a gentle fade to silence. The way a snowflake lands on the ice and melts. The way the last notes of a piece of music dissolve into the air. The way all beautiful things eventually end. The people who played with Lemieux during those years have spoken at length about what it was like to share the ice with him. Ron Francis, the cerebral centre who was acquired from Hartford in 1991 to play alongside Lemieux, has described the experience as the highlight of his career. Francis was himself a Hall of Fame player. Smart, skilled, supremely reliable. But he readily acknowledged that playing with Lemieux was like being part of something supernatural. The passes would arrive on his stick blade at impossible angles, threaded through spaces that did not appear to exist. The plays would develop at a speed that was beyond what Francis had experienced with any other player. And the expectations were absolute. Lemieux demanded excellence from his teammates, not through words, but through example. He played at such an extraordinary level that everyone around him was forced to elevate their game simply to keep up. Jaromir Jagr, who arrived in Pittsburgh as a 19-year-old Czech prodigy in 1990, has spoken even more effusively about Lemieux's influence. Jagr, who would go on to become one of the most prolific scorers in NHL history himself, has credited Lemieux with teaching him how to be a professional, how to prepare for games, how to manage the physical demands of a long season, how to handle the pressure of being a star player in a high-profile market. Jagr has also spoken about the cancer diagnosis and its impact on the team, describing it as a moment that changed his understanding of what was important in life. Watching Lemieux fight cancer and come back to play at an elite level taught Jagr that talent alone was not enough. That character and resilience, and the willingness to endure suffering, were the qualities that separated the great from the truly legendary. Tom Barrasso, the goaltender who backstopped the Penguins to both Stanley Cup championships, has described Lemieux as the most competitive person he ever met. Not the most talkative, not the most vocal, not the most demonstrative, but the most competitive. Lemieux hated losing with a quiet ferocity that was evident to everyone who played alongside him. He did not throw tantrums or break sticks or scream at referees. He simply refused to accept defeat. He would take the ice in the third period of a game the Penguins were losing and will them back into contention through the sheer force of his play. He would find extra reserves of energy that should not have existed given the condition of his body. He would make plays that were beyond the capability of any other player in the world, and he would make them at the exact moment when they mattered most. Kevin Stevens, the bruising winger who played on Lemieux's left side during the championship years, has spoken about the physical courage that Lemieux displayed on a nightly basis. Stevens, himself one of the toughest players in the league, was awed by Lemieux's ability to absorb punishment and keep performing. Opposing teams made it their explicit strategy to hit Lemieux as hard and as often as possible, particularly in the lower back, where his chronic injury was most vulnerable. Defenders would cross-check him in the spine. Forwards would run him from behind. The abuse was constant and deliberate, and Lemieux took it all. He did not complain. He did not retaliate. He did not ask for protection from the referees. He simply absorbed the punishment, picked himself up off the ice, and continued to do things that no one else could do. Scotty Bowman, who coached Lemieux during the 1992 championship season, and who had previously coached some of the greatest players in hockey history, including Guy Lafleur, Steve Yzerman, and the entire Montreal Canadiens dynasty of the 1970s, has called Lemieux the most talented player he ever coached. This is a statement of considerable weight, given that Bowman holds the record for most wins by a head coach in NHL history and has seen more hockey than perhaps any other living person. Bowman, known for his demanding and sometimes difficult personality, made an exception for Lemieux. He recognized that Lemieux was different from other players, that the normal rules did not apply, that trying to fit Mario Lemieux into a system was like trying to fit the ocean into a bottle, futile and counterproductive. Instead, Bowman built his system around Lemieux, giving him the freedom to operate on instinct, while structuring the rest of the team to support and complement his genius. These testimonials, taken together, paint a portrait of a player who was not merely skilled but extraordinary in a way that defied conventional analysis. Hockey is a team sport, perhaps the most team-dependent of all major professional sports. A single player, no matter how talented, cannot control the outcome of a game the way a dominant pitcher can in baseball, or a star quarterback can in football. But Lemieux came closer than anyone since Gretzky to doing exactly that. He bent the game to his will. He made the players around him better by his mere presence. He changed the outcome of games, series, and seasons through the force of his talent and the depth of his determination, and he did it while carrying physical burdens that would have crushed a lesser man. The legacy of the cancer season, the 1992-93 campaign, deserves special emphasis in any accounting of Lemieux's key moments, because it was not just the best season of his career. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the 10 or 15 greatest individual seasons in the history of professional sports. Not just hockey, all professional sports. A player was diagnosed with cancer in the middle of the season. He missed 24 games for treatment. He came back on the day of his last radiation session, and he won the scoring title and the MVP award anyway. Find another example. In any sport, in any era, you will not find one. It stands alone, a monument to human willpower and extraordinary talent, a story that transcends the boundaries of hockey and belongs to the broader narrative of what human beings are capable of when they refuse to surrender. The broader impact of Lemieux's career on the Pittsburgh Penguins as an institution cannot be overstated. When he arrived in 1984, the franchise was on life support. Attendance was dismal. The team was losing money at a rate that threatened its existence. There were active discussions about relocating the team to another city. The Civic Arena, with its distinctive retractable dome, was more often a monument to empty seats than a cathedral of sport. Hockey in Pittsburgh was an afterthought, a footnote to the Steelers' dominance and the city's football-first culture. Lemieux changed all of that. Not overnight, and not through marketing or publicity, but through the simple, irresistible force of his talent. People came to see him play. They came because word spread, through newspaper articles, through television highlights, through the breathless accounts of friends and neighbors who had witnessed something extraordinary at the arena the night before, that there was a man on the ice in Pittsburgh who could do things that defied belief. They came once out of curiosity and returned because they had never seen anything like it. Attendance rose steadily throughout his early years. By the time the Penguins won their first Stanley Cup in 1991, the Civic Arena was routinely sold out. Hockey had become a major sport in Pittsburgh, and it was entirely because of one man. The economic impact extended beyond ticket sales. Corporate sponsorships increased. Television ratings climbed. The city's identity began to shift. Pittsburgh was no longer just a Steelers town. It was a hockey town too. The Penguins became a source of civic pride, a symbol of the city's revival and resilience. And at the center of it all was Lemieux, quiet, dignified, letting his play speak for him, carrying the weight of an entire franchise and an entire city without complaint. When the franchise nearly collapsed in the late 1990s, it was Lemieux who saved it. When the franchise needed a new arena to ensure its long-term viability, it was Lemieux who championed the cause. When the franchise needed a bridge from one era of greatness to the next, it was Lemieux who provided it. First by drafting Sidney Crosby with the first overall pick in 2005, and then by mentoring Crosby in the same way that no one had mentored him when he arrived in Pittsburgh as a teenager 2 decades earlier. Crosby lived in Lemieux's home during his early years in the city. He ate dinner with the Lemieux family. He learned from watching Mario not just how to play hockey, but how to carry the responsibility of being the face of a franchise with grace and humility and quiet strength. The line of succession from Lemieux to Crosby is one of the most remarkable in the history of professional sports. One generational talent directly mentoring the next, passing along not just technical knowledge, but a culture of excellence, a standard of conduct, a way of being a champion. Crosby went on to lead the Penguins to 3 more Stanley Cup championships in 2009, 2016, and 2017, bringing the franchise's total to 5. Each of those championships bore Lemieux's fingerprints. The culture he established, the standard he set, the expectation of excellence he created. These things outlived his playing career and continued to produce results long after his last shift on the ice. The story of Mario Lemieux's key moments and challenges is, in the end, a story about the relationship between talent and adversity. He was given more natural ability than almost any hockey player in history, and he was also given more obstacles, more pain, more illness, more physical limitation than any player of comparable talent has ever faced. The tension between those two forces, the incredible talent pulling him forward and the incredible burden pulling him back, is what makes his career so compelling, so heartbreaking, and so ultimately inspiring. He was never fully what he could have been. The healthy version of Mario Lemieux, the one who played 80 games a year for 20 seasons without interruption, exists only in imagination. But the real Mario Lemieux, the one who fought cancer and played through a broken back and came out of retirement at 35 and won an Olympic gold medal at 36, accomplished something that the imaginary version never could. He showed the world what courage looks like, not the loud kind, not the flashy kind, the quiet kind, the kind that gets out of bed when every fibre of your body is begging you to stay down, the kind that laces up the skates when the pain says stop, the kind that refuses, absolutely refuses, to let the worst that life can throw at you be the final word. There is a version of the Mario Lemieux story that is neat and tidy, the version where a great player gets sick, fights through it, comes back, and everything is fine. The inspirational version, the one that fits on a motivational poster or in a 30-second highlight package. But the real story, the one that matters, the one that deserves to be told, is messier than that. It is quieter, it is heavier, and it begins in the spaces between the games, in the moments that no camera captured, in the private anguish of a man who spent the part of 2 decades at war with his own body. The radiation treatments for Hodgkin lymphoma were not a simple inconvenience. They were a sustained assault on Lemieux's physical being. The standard course of treatment in the early 1990s involved focused radiation directed at the lymph nodes in the affected area. For Lemieux, this meant the neck and upper chest, the very region that a hockey player relies on for everything from skating posture to stick handling to absorbing body checks along the boards. The radiation targeted the cancer cells, but it could not distinguish between cancerous tissue and healthy tissue in the surrounding area. It damaged both. It burned his skin. It destroyed cells that were needed for recovery. It left him with a fatigue so deep and so pervasive that even basic daily activities became exhausting. Getting dressed in the morning was an ordeal. Walking from his car to his front door felt like crossing a vast distance. Sitting upright for more than a few minutes required an effort of will that was disproportionate to the simplicity of the task. And yet, the public narrative focused almost entirely on his return, on the goal he scored in Philadelphia hours after his final treatment, on the points he piled up in those final 20 games, on the Art Ross Trophy and the Hart Trophy and the 17-game winning streak. The courage of the comeback was real, and it deserves every word of praise it has ever received. But the private cost of that courage has been largely overlooked, because what Mario Lemieux did, playing professional hockey while his body was still recovering from cancer treatment, was not just brave. It was physically devastating, in ways that the public never saw and that Lemieux himself never discussed publicly. Every game he played during that stretch pushed his body further than medical wisdom would have advised. Every shift accelerated the wear on a system that was already compromised by weeks of radiation. The comeback was a triumph of the human spirit. It was also a transaction. He traded future health for present glory. He spent years of his body's reserves in weeks of extraordinary performance. And the interest on that debt would come due in the years that followed, silently and relentlessly, compounding with every season. Let that sink in. A man who had just undergone radiation treatment for cancer chose to return to a professional sport at the highest level of competition, knowing, on some level, at least, that it would damage his body further, knowing that it would compromise his recovery, knowing that the long-term consequences were uncertain and potentially severe. He did it because he loved the game. He did it because Pittsburgh needed him. He did it because he was Mario Lemieux, and the ice was the only place where he felt whole. But the cost was real, and it accumulated over the years like snow on a roof, invisible at first, adding weight so gradually that no single day seemed alarming, until one morning the roof begins to sag, and you realize that the burden has been growing all along. The back problems, which had plagued him since his teenage years, were made significantly worse by the combination of cancer treatment and the physical demands of professional hockey. Radiation therapy can accelerate degenerative conditions in ways that are not always immediately apparent. The chronic inflammation in Lemieux's spine was exacerbated by the treatments, and the muscles that supported his back, weakened by weeks of inactivity and illness, never fully returned to their pre-cancer strength. By the mid-1990s, Lemieux was managing a level of pain that would have been debilitating for an ordinary person. He required anti-inflammatory medications before every game, sometimes multiple types administered through different methods. He underwent regular epidural injections, a procedure that involves inserting a needle into the space around the spinal cord to deliver steroids directly to the site of inflammation. He spent hours in treatment rooms before games, lying on tables while therapists worked on his back, trying to coax enough flexibility and mobility from his damaged spine to allow him to function at a professional level for 60 minutes of hockey. The hip problems that emerged during his comeback years were yet another consequence of the cascade of injuries and illness that defined his physical existence. When the back is compromised, the body compensates. The hips absorb stresses they were never designed to handle. The knees adjust their mechanics. The ankles change their alignment. The entire kinetic chain, the interconnected system of joints and muscles and tendons that allows a hockey player to skate, is disrupted. For Lemieux, this meant that by the time he attempted his comeback in 2000, he was not just fighting the effects of age and time away from the game. He was fighting a body that had been systematically undermined by years of cumulative damage. The cancer treatment had weakened the foundation, the back problems had compromised the structure, and the hip issues were the final crack in a building that was still standing only through the stubbornness of its architect. There is a deeper truth about Mario Lemieux that his admirers rarely discuss, and it is this: the game he loved was slowly destroying him. Not in the sudden, dramatic way that a catastrophic injury destroys a career, but in the slow, grinding way that water erodes stone. Every season he played shortened his functional life by some measurable increment. Every game added another crack to an already fractured foundation. He knew this. His doctors told him in clear, unambiguous terms. His family watched it happen with the helpless anguish of people who love someone who is engaged in something magnificent and self-destructive at the same time. And still he played, because the alternative, a life without hockey, a life where the ice was only something he could watch from a luxury suite, instead of something he could feel beneath his blades, was something he could not bear to contemplate. The ice was not just where he worked, it was where he existed most fully and most authentically. It was the only place where his body, damaged and deteriorating as it was, still made complete sense. On the ice, the pain receded into the background. The fatigue lifted. The disease and the injuries and the weight of expectation all fell away, replaced by the singular focus of competition. There was only the puck and the net and the frozen surface and the ancient, primal thrill of the game. The ice was his sanctuary, and leaving it, even temporarily, even for the sake of his health, felt like a kind of exile. Let that sink in. The greatest natural talent in the history of hockey, a man whose physical gifts were so extraordinary that they redefined what people believed was possible in the sport, spent the majority of his career in chronic pain, not occasional discomfort, not the routine aches and pains that every professional athlete experiences as part of the bargain. Deep, chronic, debilitating pain that colored every aspect of his existence. He woke up with it, he went to sleep with it, he carried it onto the ice, and into the locker room, and home to his family, and into the private spaces of his life where no one was watching. And he never complained. Not publicly, not to the media, not in a way that sought sympathy or special treatment. He simply endured, and he played, and he scored, and he won. And the world marveled at his brilliance, without knowing the full price he was paying for it. The cancer itself, while successfully treated, left scars that extended far beyond the physical. A cancer diagnosis at the age of 27, in the absolute prime of life, at the peak of a career, changes as a person in ways that are difficult to articulate to anyone who has not experienced it. It introduces a constant low-level awareness of mortality that never fully goes away, a recognition that the body is fragile, that health is not guaranteed, that the future, which once seemed infinite and full of certainty, is actually finite and uncertain and subject to revision without warning. Lemieux dealt with this awareness in his uncharacteristic way, quietly, privately, without drama or self-pity. But it was there. It informed every decision he made from that point forward. The knowledge that he had once been seriously ill, that the cancer could return at any time, that the remission was a reprieve and not a guarantee, gave every game, every goal, every moment on the ice a weight and a significance that transcended the merely athletic. His teammates during those years have spoken at length about the effect Lemieux's cancer battle had on the locker room and on their own understanding of what mattered in life. Ron Francis, who played alongside Lemieux for several seasons, described the experience of watching his captain undergo cancer treatment and then return to lead the team as the most inspiring thing he had ever witnessed in sports. Francis was a veteran of more than 1,000 NHL games. He had seen every kind of courage the sport demanded. But watching Lemieux play through cancer was something different. It was something that went beyond sport. Jeremy Agger, who was a young man during the cancer season, has said that watching Lemieux's battle changed his perspective permanently. It taught him that hockey, for all its importance, was ultimately just a game, that the real contest, the one that truly mattered, was the contest between the human spirit and the forces that seek to diminish it. And in that contest, Mario Lemieux was undefeated. The financial dimension adds yet another layer to the story. When Lemieux retired in 1997, the Penguins owed him approximately $32 million. When he converted that debt into ownership, he assumed responsibility for a franchise that was hemorrhaging money. The dual role of owner and, later, player created stresses and contradictions that no one had ever navigated before. How does a man who owns a team also play for it? How does he negotiate with himself? How does he make business decisions that might conflict with his personal desires as a player? Lemieux handled these tensions with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, but they added yet another burden to a man who was already carrying more than seemed humanly possible. The man behind the legend was not a public figure in the way that modern athletes are expected to be. He did not seek attention. He did not cultivate a media persona. He did not share his private struggles with the public through social media or tell-all interviews. He was, in many ways, the last of a dying breed, a superstar who believed that his work should speak for itself, that his achievements on the ice were the only statement he needed to make. This reticence was sometimes misinterpreted as arrogance or coldness. It was neither. It was privacy. It was dignity. It was the quiet strength of a man who understood that the truest courage is the courage that does not need an audience. The deeper truth of Mario Lemieux is not that he was a great hockey player who overcame cancer. That is the surface narrative, And while it is accurate as far as it goes, it does not go nearly far enough. The deeper truth is that his entire career, from the first game to the last, was a sustained act of defiance against the limitations of the human body, against a spine that refused to cooperate, against a disease that tried to kill him, against the relentless passage of time and the accumulation of damage and the slow, inevitable decline that claims every athlete eventually. He fought all of it. He fought it with grace and with stubbornness and with a fierce, quiet dignity that only those closest to him ever fully witnessed. And in the end, the body won. It always does. But what Mario Lemieux accomplished along the way, what he gave to the game and to the city and to every person who ever watched him play, endures beyond the body. It is permanent. It is beyond the reach of cancer or injury or the passage of years. It lives in the record books, and in the silver of the Stanley Cup, and in the memories of everyone who saw number 66 take the ice and make the impossible look as natural as breathing. And there is something else, something that often gets lost in the celebration of his athletic feats, the loneliness. Not the loneliness of isolation, because Lemieux had his family, his teammates, his friends, but the loneliness that comes from carrying a weight that no one else can fully understand. When he lay on the treatment table receiving radiation, the room was quiet, and the technicians were professional, and the machine hummed its mechanical song, and he was alone with his thoughts in a way that no amount of companionship could remedy. The machine did not know that it was treating one of the greatest hockey players who had ever lived. It did not know that the body it was irradiating had scored 5 goals in 5 different ways in a single NHL game. It did not care. It simply delivered its prescribed dose. And the man on the table absorbed it, and the cells in his body, both the cancerous ones and the healthy ones, responded according to the pitiless logic of biology. There were nights during the treatment when he could not sleep, when the fatigue was so deep and so all-encompassing that it felt less like tiredness and more like gravity itself pulling him down into the mattress. His wife, Natalie, was his anchor during those months, a steadying presence in a world that had suddenly become unstable and frightening. She managed the household. She shielded the children from the worst of it. She did what the partners of cancer patients have always done, which is everything that needs to be done, quietly and without complaint, while carrying their own fear and grief in silence. The Lemieux marriage endured this trial the way it endured everything, privately, with minimal fanfare, with a mutual understanding that some things are too important and too sacred to be shared with the public. The children, too, became part of the story in ways that are difficult to fully account for. Lauren, the eldest, was young enough during the cancer year that the full implications may not have registered immediately. But children absorb more than adults realize. They sense the tension. They notice the whispered conversations and the closed doors and the subtle shift in the household atmosphere that accompanies serious illness. Stephanie, Austin, and Alexa came later, born into a family that had already been shaped by cancer's shadow. They grew up with a father who was simultaneously one of the most famous athletes in the world and a man who had confronted his own mortality before most people begin to consider such things. What does that do to a family? How does it shape the children's understanding of their father, of success, of what matters? These are questions that the Lemieux family has largely declined to answer publicly, and that refusal itself speaks volumes about who they are. Let that sink in. A man goes through cancer treatment in the morning and scores a goal in the evening, and the world celebrates the goal without fully reckoning with the morning. The triumph is visible, the suffering is hidden, and this was by design. Lemieux chose to present the triumph and conceal the suffering, not because he was stoic by nature, though he was, but because he believed that the team needed his strength more than it needed his vulnerability. He understood intuitively that a captain's primary obligation is to embody the possibility of victory. If the captain shows doubt, the team doubts. If the captain shows fear, the team fears. If the captain shows weakness, the team weakens. And so Mario Lemieux showed none of these things, even when he felt all of them, even when doubt and fear and weakness would have been entirely justified, entirely human, entirely understandable. There is a photograph that has never been widely published. It shows Lemieux sitting alone in the Penguins' locker room, still in his equipment, head bowed, in what appears to be a moment of complete exhaustion. The photograph was taken during the 1993 season, after a game that followed a morning radiation session. The photographer who captured it, a team employee, chose not to release it out of respect for Lemieux's privacy. Its existence is known only through second-hand accounts. But the image it describes, a great athlete, alone, spent, the invisible weight of disease pressing down on him in a quiet room, captures something essential about the Lemieux story. The public saw the goals and the assists and the standings and the wins. This photograph, if it exists as described, captured the cost. The medical community, too, has reflected on Lemieux's case with a mixture of admiration and clinical interest. His treatment followed the standard protocol for Hodgkin lymphoma at the time. Radiation therapy targeting the affected lymph nodes, with careful monitoring for recurrence. What was not standard was the patient's insistence on continuing to perform at an elite athletic level during the treatment. Medical literature contains very few cases of professional athletes competing during active cancer treatment, and even fewer cases of athletes competing successfully. Lemieux's case is essentially without precedent. His doctors, while supportive of his desire to play, were navigating uncharted territory. The effects of radiation on athletic performance were not well studied. The interaction between the immune suppression caused by treatment and the physical demands of professional hockey was unknown. They were making educated guesses, monitoring closely, hoping for the best, and the best, remarkably, is what they got. But the best came with caveats that would unfold over years and decades. The long-term effects of radiation therapy include increased risk of secondary cancers, cardiovascular complications, and chronic fatigue. Lemieux's subsequent health challenges, the persistent back problems that worsened with age, the irregular heartbeat that was diagnosed later, the general physical deterioration that accelerated beyond what would be expected from hockey alone, may or may not be related to his cancer treatment. The medical community is careful about drawing direct causal connections, but the body remembers what it has endured. Every dose of radiation leaves a trace. Every cancer cell destroyed takes healthy tissue with it. The treatment saved his life, and for that it deserves every measure of gratitude. But it also exacted a toll that is still being paid, quietly, in ways that the public will likely never fully know. The measure of a life is not found in statistics, though the statistics are remarkable. It is not found in trophies, though the trophies fill cases. The measure of a life, particularly a life lived in the public eye, a life devoted to a craft that millions follow with devotion, is found in what endures after the final game has been played and the arena lights have dimmed and the man himself has stepped away from the ice for the last time. Mario Lemieux's legacy in Pittsburgh is not a matter of debate. It is settled. It is woven into the city's identity in a way that transcends sport and enters the realm of civic mythology. There are cities that are associated with certain athletes. Green Bay with Lombardi, Chicago with Jordan, New York with Ruth. Pittsburgh belongs to Lemieux in a way that is perhaps even more profound, because he did not merely play there. He saved the franchise. He bought the team. He mentored his successor. He ensured that professional hockey would continue to exist in a city that, by every rational financial calculation, probably should not have been able to support it. The Mario Lemieux Foundation, established in 1993, the same year as his cancer diagnosis, as if the diagnosis itself was the catalyst for a commitment to something larger, has raised tens of millions of dollars for cancer research and patient care. The Foundation's flagship facility, the Austin's Playroom Project, named after Lemieux's son, builds therapeutic playrooms in hospitals across the country, giving children undergoing cancer treatment a space to be children during the most frightening experience of their lives. The project is quintessentially Lemieux, quiet, practical, focused on doing rather than talking, motivated by personal experience, and executed with a level of excellence that reflects the man behind it. When Sidney Crosby arrived in Pittsburgh in 2005, the symmetry was almost too perfect to be coincidental. Another generational talent, another #1 overall pick, another French-Canadian prodigy destined to redefine the sport, and Lemieux, now the owner, did something extraordinary. He opened his home to Crosby. The young man lived with the Lemieux family during his first years in Pittsburgh, absorbing not just hockey wisdom, but a model of how to conduct oneself as a superstar and as a human being. Crosby has spoken repeatedly about the influence Lemieux had on his development, not only as a player, but as a person. The mentorship was not formal. There were no structured lessons or scheduled tutorials. It was organic. It was familial. It was Lemieux showing Crosby, through daily example, what it looked like to carry the weight of a franchise and a city's hopes with grace and without complaint. The Penguins won the Stanley Cup in 2009, with Crosby as captain and Lemieux as owner. They won it again in 2016 and 2017. 3 more championships to add to the 2 that Lemieux won as a player. 5 Stanley Cups connected, directly or indirectly, to one man. No other individual in the history of professional hockey, arguably no other individual in the history of North American professional sports, has been responsible for a franchise's success in so many different capacities. Player, captain, savior, owner, mentor. The roles multiplied, and in each one, Lemieux excelled with the same quiet, relentless competence. The broader hockey world has recognized Lemieux's significance in ways both formal and informal. His number 66 was retired by the Penguins in a ceremony that filled the arena and the streets outside it. He was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1997. The mandatory 3-year waiting period waived in acknowledgement of his extraordinary career. He has been named to virtually every all-time greatest team, every retrospective list, every ranking that attempts to identify the finest players in hockey history. He sits alongside Gretzky in the pantheon, and there are those reasonable, knowledgeable people who argue that Lemieux, on a per-game basis, adjusting for the games and seasons lost to injury and illness, was the more talented player of the 2. The debate is ultimately unresolvable, which is itself a testament to how remarkable Lemieux was. To be mentioned in the same breath as Wayne Gretzky, to be considered by many his equal or even his superior, is an achievement that requires no further elaboration. But the legacy that matters most is the one that cannot be quantified. It is the memory of what it felt like to watch him play, the way the arena atmosphere changed when he touched the puck, the collective intake of breath that accompanied his acceleration through the neutral zone, the impossible angle of a backhand that somehow found the top corner, the way he made the game look easy, effortless, as if he was operating according to a different set of physical laws than everyone else on the ice. People who saw Lemieux play in person carry those memories with a particular vividness. They remember where they were sitting. They remember the sound of the crowd. They remember the specific goal or pass or moment that made them realize they were watching something that they would never see again. Pittsburgh, as a city, underwent its own transformation during the Lemieux years. The steel industry that had defined the city for a century was dying when Lemieux arrived in 1984. The population was declining, the economy was contracting, the mood was bleak. The Penguins' rise, catalyzed by Lemieux's arrival, was part of a broader civic renaissance that saw Pittsburgh reinvent itself as a center for technology, healthcare, and education. It would be an overstatement to credit Lemieux with the city's economic revival, but it would be an understatement to ignore his role in it. He gave the city something to believe in during its darkest years. He provided a focal point for civic pride when there was precious little else to be proud of. He showed Pittsburgh that excellence was possible, that greatness could emerge from struggle, that the story was not over. The man himself has aged into a kind of dignified elder statesmanship. He attends Penguins games. He manages the franchise. He supports his foundation. He lives in Pittsburgh with the same quiet permanence that has characterized his entire relationship with the city. He does not give many interviews. He does not seek the spotlight. He is, as he has always been, a private man in a public role, fulfilling his obligations with grace while guarding his inner life with a firmness that borders on the absolute. And perhaps that is the most fitting legacy of all. In an age of constant self-promotion, of athletes who treat every meal and workout and opinion as content to be shared with the world, Mario Lemieux remains resolutely himself. Quiet, private, dignified, letting his work speak in a voice louder than any microphone could amplify. The ice remembers what he did. The city remembers who he was. The Stanley Cup, engraved with his name as both a player and an owner, remembers everything. There is a moment, in every arena, just before the game begins. The lights have dimmed. The announcements have been made. The crowd has settled into its seats with its beer and its popcorn and its programs, and for a single, suspended instant, the building falls quiet. Not silent, an arena is never truly silent, but quiet in a way that feels almost sacred. The ice gleams under the lights, freshly resurfaced, unmarked, a blank canvas waiting for the first blade to cut its surface. It is a moment of pure possibility. Anything could happen. Everything is ahead. The scoreboard reads 0-0, and the game stretches out before you like an unwritten story. It was in moments like these that Mario Lemieux was most fully himself. Standing at centre ice, stick resting on his knees, eyes scanning the opposing players, his body still, but his mind already moving at a speed that no one else in the building could match. He knew, in those quiet seconds before the puck dropped, exactly what he was going to do. He could see the patterns before they formed. He could anticipate the play 3 and 4 moves ahead, like a chess grandmaster who sees the endgame while everyone else is still contemplating the opening. And when the puck dropped and the game began, he would execute what he had envisioned with a precision and a beauty that made grown men weep and children dream. We have spent a long time with this story. We have traced the arc from Villemar to the Hockey Hall of Fame, from a shy boy on a frozen backyard rink to a man who saved a franchise and battled cancer and redefined what was possible in his sport. We have examined the statistics and the trophies and the contracts and the medical records. We have listened to the testimony of teammates and opponents and doctors and family members. And through all of it, through the triumphs and the setbacks, the goals and the treatments, the championships and the retirements and the comebacks, one truth has remained constant. Mario Lemieux never asked for sympathy. He never asked for special consideration. He never positioned himself as a victim of circumstance or a martyr to his own body's failures. He simply played. He played through a back that screamed with every stride. He played through cancer treatments that left him so exhausted he could barely stand. He played through the accumulated damage of 15 professional seasons in the most physically demanding team sport on earth. He played because playing was what he did. It was who he was. The ice was not just his workplace, it was his home. It was the one place where the pain receded and the disease did not matter, and the body, despite all its betrayals, still remembered how to do something magnificent. The story of Mario Lemieux is, in the end, a story about the relationship between greatness and suffering, not the romanticized version, where suffering is ennobling and pain is purifying and the hero emerges stronger for having endured. That is a comfortable narrative, and it contains a kernel of truth, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is messier. The whole truth includes the nights when the pain was too much, and the fear was too real, and the future was too uncertain. It includes the mornings after radiation when the nausea was so intense that the thought of putting on skates and competing against the best athletes in the world seemed not merely difficult, but genuinely insane. It includes the quiet, private moments of doubt that even the most resolute person experiences when their body is trying to destroy itself from the inside out. But the whole truth also includes this. He did it anyway. He got up, he got dressed, he went to the rink, he took the ice, and he played at a level that no one else in the world, healthy or sick, young or old, gifted or ordinary, could approach. That is not a fairy tale. That is not a myth constructed by sports writers or marketing departments or nostalgia. That is a documented, verified, indisputable fact. Mario Lemieux, while undergoing active treatment for Hodge professional hockey at a level that won him the Art Ross Trophy as the league's leading scorer, he did this in fewer games than anyone else in the league played. He did this while missing weeks to radiation sessions. He did this while his body was at war with itself, and he made it look, to the untrained eye, almost easy. The arena is quiet now. The civic arena where Lemieux played his greatest games has been demolished, replaced by a parking lot that serves the new building next door. The ice surface where he scored his first goal and his 500th and his last has melted and evaporated and dispersed into the atmosphere. The boards he crashed into are landfill. The glass that shook when the crowd erupted has been recycled into something else entirely. The physical space no longer exists, but spaces are just geometry. What happened in those spaces? The artistry, the courage, the defiance of every limitation the universe imposed, that is permanent. If you were to ask Mario Lemieux himself what he wants to be remembered for, he would probably deflect the question. He might mention the team, the Stanley Cups, his teammates, the city. He would almost certainly not mention the cancer. He would not mention the pain. He would not mention the sacrifice or the suffering or the private cost of his public brilliance. That is who he is. That is who he has always been. A man who let his work speak and kept his wounds hidden and believed with an unshakable conviction that what you do matters infinitely more than what you say about what you do. But we can say it for him. We can say that Mario Lemieux was magnificent, not just on the ice, where his magnificence was self-evident, but in the way he carried himself through a life that tested him in ways that most people will never be tested, in the way he faced cancer with courage and dignity, in the way he saved a franchise that no one else could save, in the way he mentored the next generation and ensured that the game he loved would continue to thrive in the city he loved, in the way he showed the world that greatness is not the absence of adversity, but the refusal to be diminished by it. The ice remembers. It remembers the weight of his stride, and the angle of his blade, and the impossible trajectory of his shot. It remembers the sound of 20,000 people rising to their feet as number 66 gathered the puck and began to accelerate, and the silence that followed as the puck found the net and the crowd held its breath in collective astonishment at what they had just witnessed. The ice remembers all of it. Every game, every goal, every moment of brilliance that made the cold surface glow with something that looked very much like warmth. And long after the last person who saw him play has gone, long after the statistics have faded into historical curiosity, and the trophies have tarnished, and the films have degraded, the story will endure. The story of a boy from Montreal who became the greatest hockey player his generation ever saw, who battled cancer and won, who saved a franchise and built a legacy, who carried a city on his broken back and never once asked for thanks. The story of Mario Lemieux, the magnificent one, who played the game the way it was meant to be played, with grace, with power, with beauty, and with a courage that the ice itself will never forget.